stunning tax we have heard from anyone anywhere in a year. It's called a wealthy homeowner's tax. You live in a nice house, you will pay a nice tax for that privilege. Can't think it will happen here? Rising British Conservative star Daniel Hannan says think again. Mr. Hannan is a member of the European Parliament, joins me now exclusively from Dallas as he's on a nationwide Liberty tour. Mr. Hannan, first off, on the borrowing going on in Britain, it's out of control. I always think it's out of control in the United States, but on a per capita basis, it's really out of control in your country, isn't
it? So out of control that in the time that it took you to ask me that question, our national debt has risen by about $35,000. And I'm not making that up.
So?
It's going up. Yeah, it's going up nearly £6,000 a second. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. And where has all the money gone? You know, we've had trillions taken from us in additional taxation, but it hasn't gone into improved public services. It hasn't gone into investment. It hasn't gone into better infrastructure. It has tended to go into swelling the state payroll and expanding the number of people who will then feel obliged to vote for the party that pays their salaries.
You know, Mr. Hannan, the last time you were here, the first time, of course, it created great waves because some of the things you warned about, many people feared would come to pass. Lo and behold, a lot of them did. We look at Britain very closely, not only because of our ancestral ties to your fine country, but also Britain was a little ahead of the world and not only experienced some of these problems, but experiencing the aftermath. So I like to think that you guys are maybe 6 months to a year ahead of us. If that is the case, we don't have a lot to look forward to.
I'm afraid not, no. We are, I think, ahead of you in this tax and spend and borrow game. And you will, if you carry on as you are, I suspect, end up where we are now, with your treasury empty, with your credit exhausted, with your credit rating downgraded, where you have Zimbabwean commentators shaking their heads over the economic mismanagement. I'm not making that up. There was an editorial in a Zimbabwean paper saying, you know, inflation in Britain is going to go out of control now with all the money that they're printing. But I hope that we're ahead of you in one other way too, which is that our electorate can see that they simply can't carry on like this. And my hope is that within the next few months there will be a new government which will then begin the monumental task of restoring order and sanity to our public finances.
I don't know about whether the sanity comes back, because we're already getting indications that we know in this country, sir, that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, it isn't so cut and dry in Great Britain, where you also have liberal Democrats, but they're their own sort of party, a rising party, but largely to challenge Labor and the Conservatives. And Liberal Party leaders there, or the Liberal Democrats, have this house wealth tax, for lack of a better term, where if you live in a house worth more than £1 million, I guess the equivalent of $1.6 million, they'll slap a tax on it. How is that going down over there right now?
Well, the Liberal Democrats, I should explain for American viewers, are a kind of a harmless party because they've got no prospect of office, and so this allows them to say things that will never actually be translated into policy, and they kind of know that, so they can entertain the rest of us and add to the gaiety of national life by coming out with these half-cocked proposals.
Yeah, but they can drag Labor down, right? They're obviously liberal. Their claim to fame was resisting the Iraq War and Britain's participation in it. But they've become a little bit more than a novelty. But they could drag Labor even more to the left, could they not?
Well, on this issue, I mean, they're right about one thing, which is that poor people, in common with everyone else, are being more heavily taxed under this government, and the tax burden on the low-paid, like on everyone else, is only going to go up because of the gaping deficit that we now have. And I think it should be a priority for any government to try and remove the disincentives that are holding people in welfare rather than seeking jobs. We've got to the stage where a lot of people acting rationally will prefer to stay on social security than to move into the employment market. And I think the easiest way of taking people out of the squalor of dependency is to reduce taxes very heavily on low-paid workers. But I mean, this idea of taxing people who live in big houses, it isn't even taxing the rich. I mean, a lot of the people who would be caught up by that, if in some parallel universe, if it were ever to happen, would be, elderly widows with very little income who are left in the big house that they had, but whose disposable means are very limited. And, we should sometimes just go back to first principles. If you raise a lot of money from people who are earning and who are well off, in order to give it away, you disincentivize the people who are earning. Right? If you tax the rich very heavily to give to the less well off, you have fewer rich people and more poor people.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hannan, but are you troubled that this has gotten to be a trend? I mean, in so many countries, they hike taxes on the well-to-do. So the argument that the well-to-do will run somewhere else, well, there are very few places to run because their taxes are going up everywhere. So where do they go? What do they do?
Oh, I think there are plenty of places that they can still go to. I mean, London particularly has been a magnet for the wealthy of all of Europe recently, and it's for that reason, by the way, that a lot of people who are not at all well off found their houses pushed up into the price brackets that they're talking about. But there's something eerie about this idea that you just go after all the other places and try and harmonise it. I mean, there's this. You've had on your show before, Neil, this concept that the G20 leaders have, that they should go after and close down what they call the tax havens. And what they mean by the tax havens are countries that have lower taxes than theirs. And the solution is not to go after what they are calling the tax havens, it's to try and make taxes in our countries competitive.
To make your own haven. That's a very
people, but the way to do that is to cut spending.
Let me ask you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
When you hear those on the left in any country say to those on the right, I would respectfully include you, you had your shot with your tax cuts and your tax credits and your low regulations and your laissez-faire attitude. And we had a financial meltdown, we had a crisis, and that's the hell it had wrought. So you had your shot. You're a young guy. I'm not saying it was you particularly, but you and your ilk, if you will, had your moment in the sun and you messed it up. What do you say to that?
If only it were so simple, if only you could blame the credit crunch on the banks. I'd have thought that the single biggest factor in the recent financial crisis was that interest rates were deliberately kept too low for too long. And that was a political decision, not a market decision. It was a mistake that was made equally by your Fed, by the European Central Bank, by the Bank of England, and by the Bank of Japan. As for the idea that this was a crisis caused by deregulation, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but as recently as last year, Congress was telling Fannie and Freddie to make more cheap loans available to more people. So now to turn around and say that the problem was a lack of regulation is a ridiculous inversion of the truth, which is that it was political interference that, if not completely caused this crisis, greatly exacerbated it. And now, political interference in an attempt to kind of stave it off through all this spending is making it worse. The recession has happened anyway, but with the difference, as a result of all this borrowing, our children and grandchildren are going to be paying off for decades to come the debts that have been amassed in the last 12 months.
All right, Mr. Hannan, you become a bit of a global rock star in the process with a lot of your warnings and musings. It's always good having you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
Daniel.